What's changed in the entertainment industry?
It's sad and even pathetic that in this new age of technology, the laws of the land haven't kept up with technology, so there's not going to be another Beatles. There's not going to be another Hendrix or Kiss or anybody else, because there's no structure. There is no record industry. There's chaos. So what you do is you work hard at doing what you do, and I work hard at what I do, and I want to get paid. I already put in more than 10,000 hours. There's that 10,000 hour principle that if you spend enough time, you get good at something. It's a good idea.
Gene Simmons just dropped a bomb. He says no chain band on earth will ever come close to the Beatles. Not now, not in the next 100 years. And the reason he gives is shaking the entire music world right now. When Gene Simmons speaks, the music industry pays attention, because he is one of those rare figures who built a legacy out of truth-telling, fearlessness, and legendary status. So when Gene Simmons recently made headlines again with his bold statement about the Beatles, it created a shockwave across social media, music forums, fan communities, and entertainment news channels. Gene Simmons declared that no band in history, past, present, or future will ever match the Beatles. And he didn't say it casually. He said it with the authority of a man who spent decades studying the craft, living on the world's biggest stages, and understanding better than most exactly how difficult it is to influence global culture. That is why his words about the Beatles carry a weight that fans find impossible to ignore. According to Gene Simmons, the Beatles were not just a band. They were the turning point of modern music, the explosion that reshaped melody, songwriting, recording, performance, sound, and the very structure of the entertainment industry. When Gene Simmons talks about the Beatles, he speaks with a mixture of admiration, nostalgia, and awe. He says that the phenomenon the Beatles created was so massive, so overwhelming, and so groundbreaking, that nobody will ever replicate it, not even with today's technology, platforms, viral culture, marketing power, or global connectivity. In his words, the Beatles didn't just succeed, they altered the trajectory of world culture. Gene Simmons often describes how the Beatles managed to achieve what seems impossible even now. They united generations, broke geographical borders, and elevated music into an emotional language that every human could understand. Gene Simmons highlights that the Beatles rose to worldwide domination in an era without internet, without music videos, without digital streaming, and without even the convenience of modern marketing tools. Yet somehow, they became the center of the world. Gene Simmons insists that this alone proves why no band will ever match them. He says if the Beatles emerged in today's era, with all the advantages new artists have, the world would still not be prepared for the kind of influence they once carried. One of the most powerful parts of Gene Simmons' argument is how he explains the timing of the Beatles' emergence. Gene Simmons says they arrived during a period when the world desperately needed a spark, a shift, something entirely new, and the Beatles filled that need instantly. Gene Simmons describes the Beatles as lightning in a bottle, a combination of magic, timing, personality, and musical genius that cannot be reproduced. He explains that bands today may reach millions, but the Beatles reached billions emotionally, spiritually, culturally, and historically. Every time Gene Simmons revisits this topic, he emphasizes that the Beatles weren't following trends. They were creating them with every song, every album, and every transformation in their image and sound. Gene Simmons also talks about how deeply the Beatles influenced musicians, including him personally. He says that the Beatles were the reason countless young people decided to pick up guitars and dream of being on stage. Gene Simmons admits that without the Beatles, many of the greatest artists in history, including himself, might never have existed in music. He often explains that the Beatles gave people permission to believe in creativity, freedom, experimentation, and this, according to him, is what makes their legacy eternal. Gene Simmons believes the Beatles are not just legendary, they are the blueprint, the foundation, and the inspiration beneath almost every musical movement that came afterward. What makes Gene Simmons' comments even more compelling is the seriousness in his tone. He doesn't speak about the Beatles as a fan. He speaks as a witness, someone who watched the world transform in real time. He insists that no matter how many new artists appear, no matter how many bands rise and fall, the Beatles will remain the unmatched giants of music history. Gene Simmons says modern bands may break records, but they will never break the psychological, emotional, and cultural barriers the Beatles shattered effortlessly. To him, the debate is closed. There is the Beatles, and then there is everyone else. Gene Simmons also points out that the longevity of the Beatles' impact is unmatched. Decades after their peak, people still talk about them, still search for their interviews, still analyze their songs, and still discover new layers in their work. Gene Simmons says that only a miracle could produce another band with that level of timeless influence. He explains that the Beatles have outlived eras, generations, and trends, and they continue to dominate discussions about music excellence. Whenever he is asked if a modern band could ever reach that level, Gene Simmons answers instantly, no, not even close. Gene Simmons believes the Beatles' dominance comes down to raw talent, chemistry, and a spirit that cannot be duplicated. He says the Beatles were more than musicians. They were storytellers, innovators, rebels, dreamers, and world changers. Gene Simmons argues that music today is incredible, but it is built on a foundation the Beatles created. This is why he believes no band will ever match them, because the world will never again experience that first shockwave of revolutionary creativity. Gene Simmons ends his perspective with a simple truth. The Beatles didn't just change music, they changed humanity. And according to him, that is why their place at the top will remain untouched forever. Gene Simmons continues talking about the Beatles. He shifts into a deeper emotional tone, almost as if he is revisiting the exact moment he first heard their music. Gene Simmons has described the experience many times, explaining how it felt like the world suddenly changed color. He says that hearing the Beatles for the first time was not simply listening to a band, it was witnessing a cultural awakening. Gene Simmons remembers how every young person around him reacted with shock, excitement, and an almost electric sense of possibility. According to him, the Beatles brought a new kind of energy into the world, one that felt limitless, transformative, and completely unpredictable. Gene Simmons believes this emotional reaction is one of the biggest reasons no future band will ever match the Beatles. He explains that the Beatles were not introduced to a world filled with distractions and digital noise. Instead, they arrived in a world that was hungry for change, and they became the spark that ignited a revolution. Gene Simmons says that when the Beatles appeared, everything, fashion, youth culture, politics, art, rebellion, romance, and even the idea of fame, shifted overnight. He insists that no modern band has the power to move global society in such an instant and dramatic way. To Gene Simmons, the Beatles were not only musicians, they were a cultural earthquake. In interviews, Gene Simmons repeatedly returns to the idea that the Beatles had an impossible combination of charm, vision, and innovation. He says their music wasn't just catchy, it was groundbreaking. Their harmonies were fresh, their melodies unforgettable, and their experiments fearless. Gene Simmons says that every time the Beatles released something new, the entire world held its breath, waiting to see what direction they would take next. That level of anticipation, fearlessness, and creativity is something Gene Simmons argues will never exist again in a future band. He explains that the Beatles never played it safe. They evolved, they transformed, and they challenged the world with every musical step they took. Another point Gene Simmons emphasizes is that the Beatles accomplished their massive cultural takeover in an incredibly short time. He says that the speed at which the Beatles grew, changed, and expanded their creative universe was almost superhuman. Gene Simmons often points out that most artists require a lifetime to build a legacy. The Beatles did it in a single decade, and even after they stopped making music together, their influence continued to rise. Gene Simmons finds this unbelievable, and he says it's another reason no band will ever stand on the same level. The Beatles created an immortal legacy in a fraction of the time that other artists need just to find their identity. Gene Simmons also talks about the emotional connection people feel with the Beatles. He says their music has an almost magical ability to cross generations effortlessly. Parents pass their songs to their children, and those children pass them again to their own kids. Gene Simmons loves the fact that even young fans who were born decades after the Beatles still feel an instant connection when they hear those melodies. He says that this timelessness is something modern bands dream of but rarely achieve. According to him, the Beatles created songs that feel alive, songs that breathe, songs that refuse to age. Gene Simmons believes that kind of emotional immortality is impossible to recreate. When discussing why future bands will never match the Beatles, Gene Simmons also points to the scale of their global influence. He explains that the Beatles didn't just dominate music charts, they dominated conversations, newspapers, magazines, and every corner of youth culture. Gene Simmons says the Beatles were everywhere, even in places that didn't speak English. He remembers stories of teenagers worldwide copying their hairstyles, their clothes, and even their attitudes. Gene Simmons believes that level of influence is not only rare, but impossible to repeat in an era where thousands of artists fight for attention every single day. Gene Simmons also highlights how the Beatles managed to earn universal respect. They were admired by critics, loved by fans, studied by musicians, and celebrated by industry experts. Gene Simmons says that it's incredibly difficult for artists to earn both mainstream popularity and critical praise at the same time. Yet the Beatles did it naturally, effortlessly, consistently. They broke every rule and still became the standard by which future musicians are measured. Gene Simmons believes that this combination of innovation, charm, global reach, and universal respect is what makes the Beatles eternally unmatched. In many interviews, Gene Simmons also talks about the raw emotional impact of the Beatles story. He says, their rise, their struggles, their evolution, and even their end carry a dramatic arc that feels almost mythical. Gene Simmons explains that the Beatles' journey wasn't just about fame. It was about destiny, timing, brotherhood, creativity, and cultural lightning, striking at the perfect moment. According to Gene Simmons, no band can recreate that kind of narrative because it wasn't planned, it was pure, historic magic. Gene Simmons finishes his argument by stating that the Beatles remain the greatest band of all time, not because nostalgia keeps them alive, but because their music still sounds alive. He says that every generation rediscovers the Beatles and feels the same shock he felt as a young boy. To Gene Simmons, that proves everything. The Beatles don't belong to a single era, they belong to humanity. And that, he insists, is why no band will ever match them. Gene Simmons believes the conversation is simple. The Beatles are not just legends, they are the definition of music greatness. And their place at the top, according to him, will remain untouched forever.